Okay. Cool. Give me 1 second. Perfect. Is this like, oops. Yeah, can everyone see that? Is that cool?
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah. Juan, I believe you wanna.
Yeah, I'll take it away from here.
Cool.
So to start off, we are Team AI of the Global Macro Team. We are comprised of one senior research fellow, Sanchit, who you just saw, and four research fellows, other research fellows, Brian, Neharika, Faison, and myself, Juan. Next slide. Now, under the theme of conflict, security, and inequality, Team AI of the Global Macro Team began brainstorming ideas in early February. After many viable suggestions by each of our team members over the course of a week of narrowing down ideas, we initially decided to track current AI trends and recidivism. And although this chosen topic did fit our theme, we later decided to broaden our focus in order to better encompass this theme, and so our members could be more engaged and passionate about the research we would be doing. In the end, we decided to focus on tracking legislation and policy and data privacy and protection. Next slide. Now, why is data privacy and protection important? Well, in the same way, the right to privacy has been regarded as an essential aspect to personal freedom, data privacy is and should be viewed in the same way, especially as it continues to grow in importance to our daily lives. In the past, however, data protection was viewed more as a luxury or even a preference, as in cases of violation of privacy or breach in personal data, there's little at stake, almost negligible, right? But within recent decades, and especially today, with the continued growth of technology and AI, data privacy and personal privacy are one and the same, making data breaches and violations of digital privacy a very serious threat to personal freedom. Next question. So now to introduce our forecasting question, would the US government implement policy to regulate AI via consumer data protection from business in the current administration? Now, in order to fully understand that, let's break down some key terms. Next slide. When referring to the US government, we initially leave that to a level like broad, because we want our forecasting to be at a national level of government rather than state or regional. Although we will be using those levels of government to track national trends later on in the presentation. Now, regulating AI is a loose term for leniency and interpretation, but it basically involves the limitation of AI usage for personal data collection and sales through specific legal constraints and allotting only certain methods of AI usage. Consumer data protection simply means any data linked to a consumer and a business site should be secured on their servers exclusively under their databanks, and if shared only after user acknowledgement and consent. And lastly, current administration just gives us a timeline under the Biden administration, which is a projected 3 to 4 years in the future. Next slide.
Yeah, so now we move on to the Fermi thinking or Fermiization of our question. And all that is the breakdown of our overarching question into logical and digestible components. All right, so dismantling the greater question of whether the federal government will implement policy into 5 sub-questions allows for a more in-depth analysis of the factors that contribute to the likelihood of policy implementation. These 5 sub-questions mainly revolve around 3 stakeholders in the specific policymaking process: the people, businesses, and the government. The questions address the current status and relationships between these various stakeholders. First, we ask how businesses currently use AI to understand consumer data. Insight to how data is utilized within the business landscape is crucial to developing an understanding of why data regulation is necessary and how government should approach it. There are many specific use cases that businesses have for data, including targeted marketing, medical analysis, and credit evaluation. But the main theme that unites all of these is personalization. Businesses employ AI algorithms on highly personalized data to deliver highly personalized results. Next, we ask what policies are currently implemented regarding this issue. There is no one standardized piece of legislation regarding data protection in the United States. Instead, there exists a patchwork of policies on the state and federal levels. California and New York are among the few states that have passed state laws regulating business use of data as a whole. Some states have laws governing specific sectors or niches, such as statutes in Illinois that govern the collection and usage of biometric data. And then we also see these sector-specific or niche laws on the federal level, which with laws like the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act governing children's and credit data respectively. And then after that, we want to understand the different stakeholder positions on the issue because this allows forecasters like us to make inferences as to what steps these stakeholders may take, if any, to influence data policy to align with their sentiments. The people or consumers of America's stance on the matter is perhaps the most unambiguous, as only 10% of consumers feel complete control over their personal information, and only 25% trust companies handling their personal data responsibly. While businesses obviously gain competitive advantages from data collection, some larger titans like Facebook and Google have iterated an interest in furthering data regulation and security, most likely because it preserves their reputation towards consumers. And then lastly, both states and federal governments have demonstrated an interest in data regulation. Within these entities, there is significant division on how to go about furthering data regulation. Private right of action and preemption, which is essentially the power dynamic between federal and state laws, are considered the most divisive issues between the two major parties in reference to data privacy law. After identifying the sentiments of stakeholders, the logical next step is to identify the ability of the stakeholders to make it such that associated policy reflects their sentiments. The reality is that representatives in government are the final word for legislative action, but may not always accurately represent their constituents. Our research finds that businesses, via lobbying, have a much more significant and measurable impact on the outcome of policy than the common people with specific regard to data privacy. That being said, activism in some cases does play an influential role in dictating the actions of the federal legislative body. Our last question takes a more normative or prescriptive approach, as opposed to the positive approach that the prior questions have taken. An attempt to consider topics of ethics surrounding data, such as ownership, transparency, and consent, allow the team to envision what federal legislation regulating data should entail.
Okay, so as Faison was talking about before, we need to understand how businesses influence policy. So first, what role does AI play in businesses? Why do they use it? A business's main goal is to generate a profit for their company. AI furthers this purpose by targeting customers, increasing efficiency through predictive analysis, and protecting against fraud schemes. Now, how much influence does a corporation even have with legislators? According to the conversation, wealthy individuals and organizations have a disproportionate influence over elected representatives. A statistic is, in 2018, Google spent $21 million on lobbying Washington. As you can see, power is concentrated in the hands of wealthy individuals who can move money around the globe untraced. This money is then used to purchase the services of lobbyists or donate to political campaigns illegally. And this privilege is not granted to smaller businesses. So now let's put both of these together. How will big corporations influence legislators to regulate AI, and what are their motives in doing so? The CEO of Google has advocated for regulation of AI. He writes that companies such as ours cannot just build promising new technology and let market forces decide how it'll be used. So going back to the statistic of Google spending $21 million on lobbying, if the CEO of Google wanted to regulate AI through backdoor means, he definitely has the power to. In economics, rules and regulations boost market leaders. Google is a market leader in the technology industry, and government's legislation will create further barriers to entry for competition in the market, which will ultimately benefit large corporations. Next slide. Okay, so these are our 5 reference classes. Number 1, how do people feel about their data being sold and monitored by businesses? The majority of Americans are concerned about their data privacy, and they have little faith in the government and businesses to regulate it. As you see the statistic, 79% of Americans are concerned about their data privacy. But because the people's opinion doesn't matter that much in the long run, and in the grand scheme of things, we assigned this reference class a 5%. Next, how businesses feel about and push policy regarding AI. Big corporations currently support increased legislation because it benefits their companies. As stated before, they have the power and resources to influence legislation significantly. Therefore, this gets a 15%. Next, we have investigation into malpractices of big companies. When the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, investigated some children's websites for deceptive practices, this scandal influenced the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998. This is an important factor in implementation of legislation regarding AI, so it gets a 10%. Next, we have the biggest one, political coalitions that involve representatives' agendas. Legislative inaccuracy deals with errors that need to be addressed at the judicial level when polarization is severe. Because representatives don't like this, they're more likely to not pass legislation at all rather than risk leaving it to the mercy of the judicial system. Since the passing of any legislation has a lot to do with red tape, this reference class gets the biggest percentage of 60%. And lastly, we have impacts of incorporating technology into businesses. When businesses use AI, they may face unintended consequences. For example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was an influential one, where developers abused the Facebook API to politically target and help their campaign. This reference class gets 10%.
Yeah, so as you can see, we have 5 reference classes and 5 percentages associated with each reference class. And the percentages kind of correlate to the importance of each reference class in answering our forecasting question. So I just want to go into specifically one reference class and kind of walk through how we analyzed it, determine its percentage, and that'll be the political party coalitions one. So we determined that this one has 60% of importance in, answering and updating our forecasting question. And to break it down, we believe that there's a lot of political gridlock in Congress, especially with polarization nowadays. And this can heavily influence what legislation gets passed and what dies in the committees. So we believe this is a really important factor in making sure that even any data privacy legislation gets passed in the first place. However, as Harika mentioned, there is coalitions that occur in Congress where politicians will kind of walk across the aisle and kind of agree on a topic to help support their constituents' preferences back home. So we hope that through these coalitions, that data privacy legislation will get passed. And because because we want our forecasting question deals with data privacy legislation on the federal level, these lawmakers are the end say all be all when it comes to these passing of legislations. No matter what these businesses or consumers say. So it is really important, and that's why we rate at 60%. And if any legislation gets passed, it's up to these lawmakers. So now I want to go into our base rate. So just to define what a base rate is just kind of an initial prediction of how likely we believe that our forecast will be right. So it's just an initial percentage that will say, hey, we're this percent likely that our forecast is correct. So how do we come up with our base rate? So essentially what we did is using those 5 reference classes that Niharika discussed. We went through each one and maybe researched 3 or 4 case studies, historical case studies where we looked in the past of previous data privacy scandals, and we try to analyze and see, hey, what's legislation passed as a result of this? So we looked at 16 cases overall. We had to throw out 4 of them due to some inconsistencies, but we finalized on 12 case studies overall. And out of those 12 case studies, 7 of them had data privacy legislation passed as a result. So taking a fraction of that, we calculated our initial base rate was 58%, meaning that to answer this forecasting question, we believe that there's a 58% chance that the US government will implement policy to regulate AI via consumer data protection in the current administration. However, this 50% is just a very initial raw number. We will take further research and further analysis, and we'll tweak this number. Maybe it'll go up, maybe it'll go down. But we'll get that later into the presentation. But this is our initial base rate number. So you guys are probably wondering, what is an example of a case study that we used to establish this 58% base rate? So I'll just give one example of one of these case studies that we looked at. So from the one reference class that was mentioned earlier, incorporating technology into businesses, we looked into one case study, specifically the Cambridge Analytica case study. If you don't know much about the scandal, essentially Cambridge Analytica is a company that kind of abused the Facebook API to collect a lot of personal information from many Facebook users and use that to provide targeted political ads to these users, which is illegal. They were a whistleblower exposed the whole mission, and as a result, commotion was a commotion arose, and as a result, two legislations actually passed. One in the state of California called the California Consumer Privacy Act, and one in the EU called the GDPR. So as a result, this is one of those 7 case studies where we analyzed it and said, hey, legislation was passed, and helped come up with that 58% base rate number.
So after Sanchez discovered the base rate and we kind of delved deeper into what does this figure really mean in terms of the grand scheme of things, we realized that we did need to make some clarifications and some adjustments to this figure, specifically by going into each of these reference classes and analyzing whether or not they truly have as large of an effect as they say they do in the initial base rate calculation. So the adjustments that we made, the major ones at the very least, came in 3 different parts, which affected the business influence, the political party cooperation, and malpractices reference classes of our initial base rate calculation. There were other factors that were definitely considered, but it turned out that the impact that they would leave on the base rate was so minuscule that it wouldn't actually change the percentage that much. And a lot of them happened to balance each other out as well. These were the figures that ended up being the highest in terms of the net change and the most impactful. To quickly go over them, in terms of business influence, we realized that wealthy individuals and organizations actually have a lot more pressure than we previously thought behind the scenes when it came to lobbying and simply influencing these legislators. And oftentimes, a couple of legislators on one side of the aisle flipping to the other can make the difference between a legislation that moves forward or is tabled or put in the trash, which is why we decided that this would increase the base rate by 2%, making it more likely that legislation is passed, as wealthy individuals and organizations are worried that in a Biden administration, it's more likely that regulation will happen under the national government. Another factor that we looked at was political party cooperation. Initially, during the past few decades, we've seen a lot of polarization in government. However, it turned out that this type of polarization doesn't actually harm the odds of legislation being passed. Rather, the more important factor are coalitions, which don't necessarily have to do with political party alignment, but rather with the opinions and necessary input of your constituents. Understanding this, polarization actually helps when it comes with the formation of various coalitions. And under a democratic controlled legislature as well as executive branch, it is more likely that legislation is going to be passed through coalitions, which is why the base rate was adjusted up 3%. But the final and most impactful adjustment that was made was definitely with regard to the malpractices. When examining the recent Facebook scandal and analyzing what type of action was taken, it was clear that the FTC seems to have more of a foothold when it comes to addressing these issues instead of Congress and the legislative branch. Hence, it seems more likely that going on to the future, if the FTC continues to take action, then it de-incentivizes the legislative branch from ever having to step foot into this area and industry as well, which is why we ended up decreasing our base rate down by 10% in this regard. In addition, we looked at some other case studies. One case study that we looked at was the Facebook case study, as previously mentioned, where we realized that the FTC ends up playing a larger role than the United States Congress when it comes to cybersecurity as well as consumer data protection. Another case study that we looked at was the Commonwealth of Virginia general cybersecurity case. Here we understood that states tend to do a better job of passing legislation in committees to regulate cybersecurity and data protection than the national government. One might say it's simply easier to regulate on a local level, and to an extent that's true. But it seems that more likely answer is that when states are able to pass legislation, it's more targeted and more detailed. And in doing so, it is able to be more effective than having to pass legislation on a national level and dealing with a lot of conflict between state and national law. The final case study that we examined was the CCPA, or the California Consumer Privacy Act that Sanchit mentioned earlier in the presentation. Specifically, what we understood was this legislation was passed in response to the Facebook scandal. And Facebook is an international company, not just one based in California. So if the conclusion is that statewide legislation can deal with multinational conglomerates that are headquartered in that respective state, then there becomes even less of an incentive for Congress to pass legislation if states like Texas, California, and New York can establish their own legislations and deal with a lot of the Fortune 500 companies and data protection issues with regard to them as well. So these are just some of the case studies that we examine in order to adjust our base rate.
So lastly, as a final extension of our project, we tried to think about what I guess legislation regarding data protection and privacy should look like. And so we listed some key elements. First is opt-out capabilities, which means when users are visiting a website or an app, they have the option to opt out of providing their data to those firms. Secondly is more about the, I guess, creation process of the legislation, and that's input of public and private sector's opinions. And so the public and private sectors have really distinct uses for data. And so taking in the opinions of both of them is really important to develop proper legislation. Third is the ability to view and delete data. We feel that's important that consumers can, I guess, once their data is collected, they can view what businesses have on them and they can delete them if they feel necessary. Fourth is the protection from algorithmic processing. A lot of businesses and firms use AI on data, and sometimes this can exhibit some sort of biases, such as recidivism. And so we think it's important that such legislation includes statutes that regulate the algorithmic processing of data. And then lastly is improved cybersecurity standards. We feel that there should be a set protocol in case of data breaches, such that I guess the everyday consumer is aware of where their data is going and whether it's been leaked. And so obviously it's important to mention some risks of this legislation. And two main ones came to our mind. The first is opting out can harm business growth. A lot of businesses in the 21st century, specifically technology-based firms, are capitalizing off of the ability to extract data from consumers. And so once more consumers stop to opt out, they have less of a competitive advantage, and a lot of these businesses will actually go bankrupt or have to shut down. And then secondly is a lack of enforcement. And so this is a big problem in terms of the GDPR, which is the legislation governing data in Europe. And so there's a lot of issues with how the policy is enforced across different countries' borders. And so this problem also translates a bit to the United States, but there is a possible form of mitigation for that. The FTC has proved pretty effective in enforcing data privacy and data laws in general. And so concretely assigning, I guess, this sort of policy to be enforced by the Federal Trade Commission could prove to be very effective. Yeah.
To conclude, we believe the probability of the US government passing national legislation is 53%. This is our new and updated base rate after weeks of research, based on the three main stakeholders of consumers, businesses, and especially political parties, with the percent weights coming from our reference class. For consumers, we can ask the question, how consumers feel about their data being sold and monitored by businesses at 5%. And the business percentage comes from grouping all of our business related categories, such as how businesses feel about pushing policy regarding AI at 15%, investigation into malpractices of big companies at 10%, and impacts of incorporating technology into businesses at another 10%. And lastly, and especially, political party cooperation at 60%. With personal recommendation of including key aspects of data protection that were just mentioned, such as opt-out capacities, ability to view and delete data, and especially improve cybersecurity standards. That is all, folks. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let us know now.
Yes, encourage all of our special guests. We have Aiden here. We also have Dr. Greg, Matthew, Andrew, William, and Gabe. Any of y'all, feel free to ask any questions to the team. We'd love to hear any of your feedback.
If this type of
do we unmute ourselves, or do we do it in chat?
Okay, so let's do Aiden first, and then we'll go to Dr. Greg, and then finally we'll go to Matt.
I guess my question is kind of broad, but if this type of legislation were to pass, like, how do you predict, I guess, what, like, the degree to which it would restrict companies from extracting data in this particular way? Like, would it be like let's like say, like, in terms of like stringency, like how stringent do you think it would be? Because they could pass something, but it doesn't necessarily would be comprehensive, is my thought. So
Yeah, so I can take a part of that question. Feel free to add on. Yeah, so on a national level, we can't be too sure what we can see because there's nothing, set in framework right now. But if you look at the states, right? For example, we mentioned the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and that one was pretty it was pretty extensive. There's a lot of like restrictions on there for businesses, such as you should allow consumers to opt out, delete their data, and not be discriminated for opting out. It's very comprehensive to answer your question. However, there is a chance for business to find loopholes, especially the bigger ones like Facebook and Google. Like Facebook has claimed that this CCPA doesn't apply to them for legal reasons. So there is a big potential for loopholes to occur if this law is not implemented and worded properly. Um, it could be very restrictive. It just depends on how well it's enforced and how well the law is regulated.
Just to quickly add on to that as well, before we go on to Dr. Greg's question, it depends a lot on kind of the macro environment as well. Again, we have political parties being the majority of the influence with regard to legislation passage. I think it also affects the effectiveness of the legislation. If we have a huge cybersecurity or data protection scandal, it's more likely to be a lot more detailed. But if it's something that just happens kind of on the side without any big stimulus, then there might be more pushback from legislators who do not want this type of more comprehensive detailed coverage. I guess I'll pass it on to Dr. Greg.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to ask if your research has provided you some information or data that allows you to address what strike me as three fairly obvious challenges that one would want to address. That is to say, a challenge from each of your three stakeholders. Consumers, we know that on the one hand, while consumer information is being abused, at the same time, we observe, for example, on social media, the complete abandon with which many consumers cheerfully fork over a great deal of personal information about themselves. Self-undermining to be sure, but it seems to be a fact that many consumers are all too willing to provide personal information. Secondly, with regard to businesses, one business model is that the business of business is to maximize profits for shareholders. And I think regulation that would restrict information might, in the long run, harm the bottom line of profit making. And businesses, I think the most attractive model, but also exceedingly unlikely, would be a business model in which businesses actually shared some of the goals of information responsibility as it is generated or collected through AI. There, by the way, we see right now that several major corporations that express dismay at efforts of the Republican Party in all 50 states to restrict voter participation, which, as we know, affects African Americans above all, have then received, at least from the Republican Party, very fierce blowback. The Senate Minority Leader McConnell said that businesses should only donate money to political parties, but should never, ever express an opinion. And then finally, political parties, you said that you might hope for coalitions that might be ad hoc that would include members of both parties. But we observe currently a Republican Party in which fealty to Donald Trump is a threshold. Any Republican elected official who openly opposes Donald Trump, such as Lynn Cheney in Wyoming or Mitt Romney in Utah, are savaged. And under these circumstances, it seems to me that the possibility of coalitions of Democrats and Republicans is less likely today than it has been probably for decades. So again, my question is, and I should imagine you've thought about all of this, how you would respond to these challenges for the very admirable program of responsible use of AI-generated consumer information.
Yeah, so I'd be willing to address the, I guess, first part of the question that you asked involving consumers. So that was another big criticism about legislation and how it doesn't put enough emphasis on personal responsibility. In the same way, like a right to privacy is, it's still a right, but it's also a personal responsibility to maintain that privacy, especially in a digital workspace or even social space. So that was also another reason why our consumer stakeholder was at a very low percentage, because there simply isn't enough movement behind data privacy and protection for consumers to realize they need more personal responsibility, or even enough to start its own movement in favor of data protection and privacy. So as a personal recommendation, that is one thing to emphasize within legislation, is how important personal responsibility is.
Yeah, and I can also touch on your second point about the businesses. So I think I completely agree with how you say that increased regulations and restrictions harm businesses, like because it hurts their bottom line. That is one thing we definitely considered when doing this research and looking at history of past legislation. For example, one of the biggest critiques of the California legislation was that it would hurt small to medium-sized businesses because they wouldn't have the capacity that maybe large companies like Facebook or Google would have, to work with these extra regulations. So it would actually harm these smaller and mid-range businesses. And Faison must have mentioned it earlier, but one thing we would propose in legislation, if it were to be passed at a national level, is that it somehow accommodates and adjusts for businesses of varying sizes, so that there's just a one-size-fits-all approach in creating policy. And that way, businesses might be more open to receiving legislation, because otherwise they'd be very opposed if it hurt their bottom line.
For sure. Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you, Dr. Gregg, for the question, as well as Aiden. I'm sorry we couldn't get to your question, Matt, but we'll just move on to the next presentation. All right, thank you so much. Let's move on to Sam.
Can you give me a hearing, George?
Thank you, George.
Sorry. Oh, yeah.
Mauricio, you got it? All right, excellent. All right, guys, thank you to the AI team for that fantastic presentation. Hoping everybody is doing okay tonight. Mauricio, are you good to go just before we get started? All right, excellent. So my name is Sam. I am the senior fellow for the China team.
Oh, Mauricio, I'm a research fellow on the China team as well.
I'm Porter Slack, and I'm also a research fellow.
I'm Morgan Myhill, and I'm a research fellow as well.
And I'm Jenna Chen, and I'm a research fellow.
Great. So as the China team here at GMT, we had a number of different interests when we were trying to decide on a research topic this semester. And our interests ranged from economics and finance to foreign relations, political institutions and technology, which initially made a lot of us think that it was going to be difficult to decide on a topic that really encompassed all our interests and gave us something that we would be passionate about. But we found an interdisciplinary topic that really touched on all of these diverse interests, which we'll get into a little bit more depth later. But this specific issue that we'll be examining and is the subject of our research is called Made in China 2025. We'll get into a little bit more, like I said, about it later, but it combines elements of all of these different interests in those that I've listed here. And the research question, just to go ahead and introduce it to you all, that we chose is, will China meet its Made in China 2025 defense critical manufacturing goals on time? And of course, that time limit is the year 2025.
So when we discuss Made in China 2025, it kind of becomes relevant to understand a little bit of a history behind the project, China's history, just to understand the motivations. So traditionally throughout human civilization, China has been a powerful leader in the world stage, and it has been actually at the center of the world economy for the majority of history. However, since the rise of European powers and eventually in 1850 to 1950, China experienced what was called the Century of Humiliation, which was basically their fall from grace, and they became sidelined. And because of this, China would like to restore its position of global leadership, and this is just a part of a plan to do that. And within the last 30 years, China has transitioned from a communist-only regime to a more hybrid communist capitalist model, which has allowed for a massive economic growth. And by 2049, China hopes to use Made in China 2025 and other projects to rival the US on the global stage.
So now we're going to talk about the first portion of our research process here to construct a forecast. And that's already a term you've heard today called the base rate. To remind you all what that means, the base rate is essentially us trying to compose a reference class of historical analogs that help inform our analysis of the likelihood of China meeting their goals for Made in China 2025. And the main challenge here is essentially trying to make a quantitative assignment out of a lot of these qualitative variables. And I'm going to explain how we did that. So the first element that we included in our reference class is Asian neighbors. The second one is 5-year plans. And these are 5-year plans instituted by China. And the rationale here is that the best possible informant of China's success is going to be their own track record. China has a rich history of using 5-year plans for the purposes of developing the economy, going decades back. So Made in China, as a variation of these 5-year plans, we look back at the 5-year plans to make a part of that base rate. And the third element here is going to be the US defense industry. And this is important because Made in China 2025 is a plan that's really targeted at developing larger defense-oriented goals in China. And so looking at the US defense industry, particularly the Made in China, the military-industrial complex in the United States, which is generally the ecosystem that's created between the government and the private defense industry. Looking at that, we can also see how successful the US has been. And we look at that because the United States defense industry is the embodiment of what China is trying to achieve. So like I mentioned before, we are trying to assign a quantitative insight out of all of these qualitative variables. And to do that, we scored each of these elements on a scale of 0 to 1. For Asian neighbors, it was kind of a niche area because when it comes to evaluating Asian neighbors, we look at South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And for these, it's kind of tricky because we're looking at the industry that was developed in these countries that are relevant to China's own Made in China 2025 goals. And so that means tech industries like semiconductor manufacturing, but it also means we have to look at the government involvement in these countries when it comes to the development of the economy and the development of that sector. Because in China's eyes, you're not being successful as a country when it comes to developing these industries if the government doesn't have a tight grip over it. So we ended up giving 0.5 for the development of the industry and 0.5 for the development in terms of how much the government was involved. And so 0.5 plus 0.5 equals that max possible score of 1. So South Korea ended up getting a score of 0.75 because generally speaking, historically, South Korea democratized pretty late in the game, and the government was pretty involved in the development of the relevant tech industry here. And on the industry side of things, we give them a pretty high score because they developed a strong semiconductor manufacturing sector. Taiwan, however, gets a pretty bad rating of 0.25 because despite the fact that they actually developed a pretty strong semiconductor industry, the government was not involved in it at all. You can maybe track some subsidies, but that was the extent of it. And then Japan, they receive 0.15, mostly due to a history of protectionism that's not really desirable for China. And overall, Asian neighbors received a score of 0.38. And just to mention briefly, we also ended up averaging all of these together at the end. The 5-year plans, it's kind of you have to take a different approach to this one because the 5-year plans are the embodiment of the government managing the growth of the economy and trying to really manage and with the end goal in sight. And so the 5-year plans, their goals is to essentially make sure that the quality of life of the Chinese people improves. And so we measured the efficacy of these plans in 2 halves. The first half had to do with macroeconomic indicators. So we looked at GDP, GDP per capita, and we essentially developed like an internal index to measure how centrally planned the economy was in China. And that's the third portion of that one. And the other half were alternative measures of the quality of life of the people in China by essentially looking at the development of particular industries like manufacturing, education, other metrics like literacy, the improvement of health in China over the course of the last 3 decades. So that's the other side of the coin when it comes to 5-year plans and measuring their efficacy. Overall, 5-year plans received 0.736. So on a scale of 0 to 1, that's pretty good performance. When it comes to US defense, we broke it down into 3 portions. 1/3 comes from the actual industry, so the development of the defense industry. And again, the domestic made in China 2025 goals are oriented towards developing a strong, independent defense industry in China. So we looked at the development of the industry in the US, then we looked at the government involvement, and then we examined international conditions. Overall, the US defense contributes to kind of a lower score than 5-year plans at 0.55, mostly because we see that when it comes to the government and international conditions, the government, the degree of their involvement is pretty much limited to R&D spending. So we see that targeted and coordinated investment is the degree to which the US government was involved in the development of the industry that China is trying to target. So again, in the eyes of China, from their perspective, pretty minimal and undesirable. When it comes to international conditions, the US developed the defense industry and the military industrial complex that we're looking at now, post World War II, following that decade. And so we see that China does not face the circumstances and conditions that are as favorable as they were to the US. So from China's perspective, it's not as favorable for them. So that's why the US defense portion of the base rate is not that strong for China. We also had to weigh these because obviously 5-year plans, the US defense industry and the Asian neighbors are not all equally as important to determining how successful China could be. 5-year plans ended up receiving 55%, meaning that they're most important. And the rationale again here is just that the 5-year plans, given that made in China 2025 is a variation of them, they're going to be the most important source of information for that base rate. The next is US defense industry because the US defense industry, like I mentioned again, is what what China is trying to emulate. So they got 30%, and the rest goes to Asian neighbors. And so the initial base rate calculation ended up with us determining it was 62.7%, meaning that that's like the first draft of our forecast right there. And we ended up adjusting it over the course of the months after we made this initial calculation. And Jenna is going to explain the framework.
We then synthesize this base rate into our firmization process. So what is firmization? It is a breakdown of a large question into smaller sub-questions that consider different categories or factors. Our team utilized firmization to break down the larger question of whether China will meet its MIC 2025 goal into specific factors of the decision-making process. We organized these factors into a final framework that outlined the MIC's defense critical domestic manufacturing goals, including the categories of domestic manufacturing and MIC itself, technology, international relations, Chinese foreign policy, political capital, and the COVID-19 response. Now, this relates to the base rate because it structures which categories we should evaluate when determining MIC success. We then accounted for recent news and developments to adjust and recalculate the base rate by making marginal changes to the original base rate as the centroid. However, our research and evaluation still remains a priority, and the firmization, base rate, and its framework are tools that we use to guide ourselves. With that, let's look into the first perspective of our framework, domestic manufacturing. We hypothesize that China's current manufacturing capacity and sophistication are sufficient enough to meet surging manufacturing demand because the country has sufficient production capacity from government investment and manufacturing expansion. Now, these resources have major economic implications by expanding both productivity and human capital, since it amasses more knowledge and action into achieving MIC's goals.
The next portion is the military-industrial complex. This is the second hypothesis in our framework out of 7. And essentially, like to reiterate, the military-industrial complex is the ecosystem that is created between the government that's focused on defense and private defense industries and firms, and the work that they do together to basically produce a good national defense. And the hypothesis here is that the military-industrial complex in China is an incubator for the innovation that is necessary in order for China to achieve the levels of advanced manufacturing that it seeks to achieve via its Made in China 2025 goal.
The next portion of our framework is technology. Our initial hypothesis was that due to the nature of China's semiconductor industry, China's capacity is insufficient to meet their goals outlined in Made in China 2025. In coming to this hypothesis, we looked at a few different things. First, we asked, is China intellectually capable of meeting their goals? Do they have the intellectual capacity? Second, we asked, do they have the physical capacity? And finally, we looked at the semiconductor industry in a vacuum. And just to pause here and make sure we're all on the same page, if you are unfamiliar with semiconductors, all you really need to know is that they are the components making up computer chips. So all in all, our hypothesis was that the semiconductor industry would hold back Made in China 2025 technology goals.
After that, we analyzed international responses, and we've decided that international responses will not cross a threshold that will inhibit China's domestic manufacturing, though they will blunt China's technological development goals, making them a net negative for the achievement of China's goals. The international community can be divided into 2 camps based on economic development, with advanced economies viewing the plan as aggressive and implementing measures to combat it, while developing economies welcome it due to the dissipation of low-skill manufacturing jobs out of China and into the wider world market. After that, we looked at China's foreign policy specifically. We decided that China's foreign policy is designed to maximize its chances of meeting its manufacturing goals. And we found that China's foreign policy simultaneously regulates the entry of foreign companies into China's market, while also attempting to expand Chinese companies' reach into developing economies. China's policy works to delicately undermine American hegemony while building trade alliances with the developing world and controlling the language of their government.
Political implications don't really end here. We also have to consider the fact that China has to implement this from a domestic sphere. And although China is an authoritarian regime, the Chinese Communist Party isn't always as united on certain issues as you might expect. But this is one of those issues where, given that this is an initiative that specifically is designed to embolden China's position on the world stage, ramp up its manufacturing capabilities, make it transition from one of those more developing countries and ramp up its manufacturing to make it far more advanced, there's a lot more consensus within the Communist Party, and therefore relatively significant support to the point where the party's commitment is relatively strong. So there's also the idea of internal affairs and potential political resistance. But again, we're dealing with an authoritarian regime, which in this case makes that another positive for the Chinese government when dealing with potential dissidents. They are few and far between, although there are a number of controversies here in the West. They don't really apply quite as much in China itself. And of course, we also have the bureaucratic capacity, which assesses the Chinese government's general ability to implement these plans. And for the most part, that also happens to be there. So for the most part, the CCP does have the legitimacy and political capital to implement Made in China 2025. And again, that domestic resistance is negligible enough that this overall stands as a positive in relation to a lot of the foreign policy concerns that exist.
Let me just step in real quick. I forgot to mention a crucial portion about the military-industrial complex and hypothesis. The military-industrial complex is not the incubator that it needs to be in order for China to meet its goals. Essentially, a good military-industrial complex is going to foster innovation and tech sharing between the private sector firms, and the government that's focused on its defense work, right? In China, due to a past of its command economy roots in which the something we call compartmentalization, where government agencies, defense agencies, private firms, and academia, they do not do enough. They operate in silos basically, and the sharing that needs to happen is not happening. That's the first reason. Second reason is that China operates in something called an absorptive model from a lot of its innovation, in which they rely on re-innovating foreign imported technologies for domestic use, and that dependency is leading to a lack of organic domestic innovation necessary for the military-industrial complex to be sufficient enough to meet their advanced manufacturing ambitions. So now COVID-19 response.
Correct. And on top of that, we'll dive back into the COVID-19 response, in which China's general ability to meet their manufacturing goals will not be compromised by the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, although some industries may struggle more than others. And this is based on two major factors. China has had a healthier economic recovery in comparison to international economies, but we still need to consider that some areas will be slightly more affected than others because of this reduced trade and disrupted supply chains because of the pandemic. And therefore, we are 62.7% confident that China can reach its defense-related critical Made in China 2025 domestic manufacturing goal on time. But there are several limitations to this statement and extent of its impact, which we will now discuss. First off, I researched domestic manufacturing, and we affirmed a slight net positive to China's domestic manufacturing, so it becomes a more likely occurrence. China has a minimum expectation with production capacity, which indicates that they do have the foundation to meet their goals, hence the slight increase to the framework forecast.
And basically, I can just reiterate what I mentioned about the military-industrial complex, that it's not the incubator that it needs to be in order for China to successfully develop its advanced manufacturing capabilities that are required in Made in China 2025.
Awesome. To wrap up technology, our research confirms our initial hypothesis that the semiconductor industry will hold China back, likely hold China back from reaching its technology goals. To return to our intellectual capacity question, we concluded that China does have the intellectual capacity to meet its goals in quote unquote soft technology sectors like AI and information technology, but none of this is true for the semiconductor industry, which is in fact the most important because it is the most defense critical since it is at the heart of the conflict between the US and China. And in the semiconductor industry, China is very intellectually reliant on foreign talent, and their semiconductors are also very not advanced. They're generations behind the rest of the world and nowhere near catching up. And they also don't have the physical capacity to manufacture these semiconductors. The US is withholding the equipment they need in order to do that. So all in all, technology contributes a net negative as to likelihood that they will achieve their goals in 2025.
There's also an interaction between the foreign and international reactions to Made in China 2025 and this technological aspect. So like was stated, China generally requires that foreign companies surrender the licenses to their intellectual property in order to operate in the Chinese market, and that's how they do the majority of their technological development. But Western nations are seeking to combat this by installing like legal measures and economic sanctions, which they can trigger whenever China does steal their intellectual property, because they feel it's unfair for the international market for China to simply steal all of the Western technology in order to boost their own technological capabilities. And so because of this, we viewed international reactions as a net negative for the ability of China to complete their goals, because it does restrict their ability to complete their semiconductor manufacturing goals. And for China's personal foreign policy, They've essentially created an internal market where Chinese companies have 100% of the advantage and Western companies are subservient and beneath Chinese companies. And this is not something that is conducive to Western investment and not going to bring very many more Western companies in with their technology. And further, we are also seeing a new type of competition where the Western world seeks to disentangle itself from China and create supply lines that essentially go around China, and therefore China's boxed out of the world market. And we're also seeing competition, military competition in several theaters. And now a new aspect with the pandemic is that Western nations and China are competing to distribute vaccine doses to developing nations in order to gain a little bit more influence in those countries.
Yes, and like I mentioned earlier, the political capital in terms of the domestic will of the Chinese Communist Party is there. It has a net positive experience or net positive effect on our forecast. But at the same time, you may be thinking that this is just a bare minimum standard that needs to be met for the plan itself to exist. But on the contrary, like mentioned, there isn't as much consensus always within the party as there is on this particular initiative. So even though there may be a number of concerns that happen to be in place with technology and foreign relations, the Chinese Communist Party is committed to fulfilling this goal like they are generally with other central planning initiatives. So that will help increase the base rate slightly in this regard.
Looking into the COVID-19 response, this factor will have a small net positive because China has shown continued economic resilience. The increase in GDP of about 2% and the quick recovery puts China in a more advantageous position to other countries, and China still has a surplus of capacity to focus on its domestic manufacturing goals.
And to summarize the effect of this framework on our overall prediction, it appears to be a lot and it is a great deal of information, but its aggregate effect is minimal as a whole. The essential components of the framework that go into influencing the final forecast are very small, with the adjustments overall on aggregate being able to be maximized at 5% positive or negative. So that means that each individual factor that we weigh can have a maximum sway of 0.7%. And after weighing up all these factors and affixing a quantitative factor to them, the aggregate effect was a decrease of 0.8%. So that means that our final base rate came out to 0.619 or 61.9%. So that is essentially what our final prediction came out to. So yes, we can expect Made in China 2025 to be met by the Chinese government, but there will be a number of caveats that need to be met. We predict that semiconductors are almost impossible to meet on time, and that there will be a number of international relations concerns for the Chinese Communist Party going forward. But as a whole, there are a number of means for Xi Jinping's government to be optimistic.
To wrap up, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we'll actually verify these predictions, since obviously no prediction is relevant unless there's a way to verify it. We hope to continue using that process that Sam just displayed with current events, and we plan to update our base rate no more than 5%, say if a current event was extremely relevant. We hope future China teams will continue this process, continue the base rate updating, and then obviously in 2025, once we're all out of college, it will be very clear whether or not predictions were correct. That's all we have, and we'd love to take any questions you have.
We have one hand from Will.
Yeah, thank you, George. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say this was a great presentation. It was really informative, and you guys worked really hard on this, and yeah, it's just great overall. My question is concerning the rise of China's the US's allies in East Asia. Over the recent years, Japan has really started to assert itself on the world stage, both by developing its intelligence community and by reasserting its self-defense force. South Korea, on the other hand, has also developed itself militarily and with respects to sharing its intelligence with other nations in the region. And so, how do you think this this development in East Asia will impact China's objective of Made in China 2025? How do you see that in the future, and how do you quantify that change?
I can answer this question. So I don't know how to, I'll get to quantifying it later, but essentially what we're seeing right now is that the US's allies in East Asia are also asserting themselves militarily and attempting to implement economic measures similarly to the West, where China can no longer steal their intellectual property and is essentially cut off. They want to build trade routes and supply chains that circumvent China. And due to this, we've seen like an alliance, an Asian NATO start to form called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And they essentially seek to contain China in what is essentially a revived containment strategy. And what they want to do is make sure that they can control the arteries of trade along like the Malacca Strait, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea in order to have the capability to just cut China off from the world economy, cut its entire economy off from the world in the event of military conflict. And they hope that that threat will serve as a means they can use to contain China.
Great response. And I think it's also very interesting to see how the developing world is going to react. There's been some controversies in the US-Filipino relationship in recent years with Duterte as president. He's obviously had some issues with China given their disputes in the South China Sea, but there have also been some more friendly relations between the two. And of course, there's issues like the Belt and Road Initiative and a lot of these Chinese infrastructure projects that are looking to expand abroad. And in the news, when we were actually looking at putting together our forecast, I gave, on our base rate, I gave the manufacturing rating a little bit of a hit because India and Australia had both rejected deals for Chinese infrastructure for large scale investments within their countries. And I think given that Australia is a traditional US ally and a developed nation that has a lot of those capabilities already, it won't hurt as much as, overtures like those of India, because the ability to have influence in countries that are members of the non-aligned movement and the like that have a lot of untapped potential in terms of markets and as potential geopolitical allies going forward, there's a lot going on there. So I think watching the relationship between the West and there's obviously been these comparisons to the Cold War and whatnot, but I think going forward, those will be the types of relationships that a lot of analysts will be looking to watch for sure.
Thanks, Sam. And final question from Gabriel.
Yeah, really great research, guys. You seem really enthusiastic and passionate about it, which is very, very encouraging. I guess my question is related to like tech and like semiconductor thesis you guys put out. So you guys said that because China's like has too much foreign dependence in their semiconductor industry. I guess when you were like making your conclusion in that part, is China not like making enough strides to reduce their foreign dependency to reach the conclusion you guys made? And I guess the second question is, Taiwan is a pretty big player in the semiconductor space. Is there like some, collaboration between China and Taiwan in semiconductors, or is that not happening at all?
I can take this. This was my area of research.
Yeah.
Answer the first question. I would say it's not so much that China isn't attempting to make the strides. They've invested a lot of money in this. They've established new colleges dedicated to semiconductors and education for that. It's that they're held back in a lot of ways. One being they're so far behind at this point, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to catch up without help. And the second being they're literally held back from getting the equipment they need to make their own semiconductors, which is the heart of the Made in China 2025 plan. They want to be able to make 70% of their own semiconductors, whereas right now they make 0 to 10% of their own. And then to the second part of your question, there's definitely like individual scale collaboration between China and say Taiwan. I know China steals a lot of like Taiwanese experts in semiconductors. They offer them really good pay and get them to move to China. The Taiwanese government, I think this was maybe last week, 2 weeks ago, actually recognized that this was happening so much, and they're getting very irritated about it because they're obviously taking experts that are very valuable out of Taiwan. And I think they're looking into making some legislation about it. So no, I would not say generally Taiwan is very cooperative nor do they really want China to succeed just because of their history. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to elaborate on.
Thank you. Answered both.
Yes, thank you so much for from Will and Gabe for the insightful questions, and from the team for the great responses and presentation. Congratulations, guys. And now we'll move on to our last showcase from the Latin America team.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I hope you guys have had a lovely day so far. I know I have, watching the showcase of our semester-long project, and technically year-long project for some of us too. So I hope that we're able to end with a bang, and Latin America can provide the content that it always provides, that you guys know that you guys came for. So specifically for you guys that are new here, we're going to be talking about AMLO's approval rating today. And so before we dive into the research topics, I want to get a chance to introduce some of our team members to those of you who are new here today. So I am the senior fellow for the Latin America team. My name is Evan, and I'm a second-year student here at UT.
Hello, I'm Chloe. I'm a first-year student at UT, and I am a research fellow on the team.
Hey, I'm Nikhil. I'm a first-year student at UT and a multi-research fellow on the team.
Hi, I'm Grania. I'm also a research fellow and a freshman at UT.
Hi, I'm Sahana. I'm also a freshman and a research fellow for Latin America team.
Wonderful. Now that you've met the team, let's look at what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the list of things that we're going to be talking about, but it's a lot of words just specified, and in a high level overview, we're going to be talking about the process of our project, how we executed on our project, and what were the key findings for the project this semester, and what even our project was about in the first place. So we'll start off by explaining what our project even was about, because I believe that'd be necessary information for all of you. Our question that we attempted to answer was, what will AMLO's approval rating be in the 2021 Mexican midterm elections? And so this is an important and crucial question for us, because we knew that approval rating is a metric for, let's say, people satisfaction, right? How people believe that an administration is doing, and whether an administration's policies are concurrent with the desires of the population. And so we wanted to see when in the midterm elections, which will take place in June/July of this year, how will the people's perception of AMLO change? But of course, before we dive into that, we need to specify who AMLO is. AMLO, or Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, is the current Mexican president as of December of 2018. He has had a stint in Mexican politics, formerly being mayor of Mexico City from 2000 to 2006, and being a part of 3 different parties. Currently, he is a member of the Morena party, which we will talk more about extensively later on. However, the key takeaway for AMLO that I want you guys to know, if you are not aware with who he is that he is considered to be a left-wing populist. What that means is that he is relatively left-wing in his political ideology, and yet he likes to cater to the people of Mexico as a populist. So diving into our research, we'll dive into our methodology first and foremost.
All right, let's talk about the methodologies we used. First, we have the Fermiization program, which is fundamental to GMT research in general. So you may have heard Jenna earlier on talking about what this is. Essentially, it is an estimation process in which we break down the big question, which for us is AMLO's approval rating, down to smaller questions that we can more easily answer. For making team decisions and team discussions, we used CIA techniques, including the red team analysis and team A, team B, in order to be less biased and to avoid groupthink. For weightings, like we talked about for Fermiization, we broke down the big question into smaller questions that we considered different divisions. And for each division, we gave them a relative weight of importance relative to the other divisions in answering the big question. For our hypotheses, these are basically our estimates that we make in each division in terms of whether it's going to positively or negatively impact our AMLO's approval rating. And lastly, when we evaluated our policy, we used the CLASP technique that comprehensively looks at the benefits and the potential downsides or hardships in completing the policy.
Thank you for that, Chloe. Now we'll be diving into our specific framework that we use for our research process. First, we'll be diving into the research divisions that we kind of broke into. We specified 6 different research divisions that we thought were pertinent to the forecasting question at hand, which again, as you recall, is to predict the approval rating for AMLO by the midterm elections. So we'll start with New Mexico's economy.
The first section we chose to predict AMLO's approval rating is Mexico's economy, specifically because we feel that not just in Mexico, but around the entire world, economy is a generally big factor in terms of just people satisfaction and approval rating. We see a pretty big correlation between economic performance and approval rating in the US, and there's also been a high correlation in Mexico as well.
For political competition, we included this because we believe that the approval rating for a political figure not only depends on how much people like that political figure, but also on how much people like that political figure relative to the other options for the position that figure holds.
The propaganda and persona division refers to the general landscape of false information spread by the government in Mexico and the self-image and likability of AMLO himself. It was important to research the extent of disinformation, media censorship, and news spread by AMLO's government and other external parties, because this directly affects voter knowledge and perception of what the government is doing and their success. So if government propaganda increased, for example, we would expect approval ratings to simultaneously increase because voters would have like a skewed perception of the government's actions and success.
In terms of militarization, it's not the military itself as an entity that affects the approval rating for AMLO in the Mexican people, but instead it's the utilization of the military as an abuse of power, or the lack thereof, as we'll investigate later. It's using this military and the human rights violations that come with the militarization that we need to understand in order to fully perceive how people perceive AMLO.
For civil liberties, we looked at how people feel their rights are being protected or not protected. I mean, it kind of follows that if you feel like the person in charge, for example, AMLO, is abusing power and not protecting civil liberties, there's going to be some ill will there.
And last but not least, obviously, we have to incorporate the policy in the pandemic category. And so this incorporates the pandemic response from the AMLO administration, which many of you may be most familiar with if you've ever heard of AMLO. But of course, in this troublesome time, you need to account for what is most prevalent and egregious at the current administration, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, again, these are our 6 research divisions, which we decided to conduct our research on. What we'll be presenting next is something slightly different. It's called our Fermi framework. Now, our Fermi framework was based off of our 6 research divisions. However, it is slightly different of 2 things. One, you'll notice that there are 4 divisions as opposed to 6 divisions. The reason why that is because we decided to encapsulate political competition within personal perception. And we decided to encapsulate militarization within civil liberties because we felt that these 4 divisions were most pertinent to actually projecting the forecast, which again, as you recall, is to forecast AMLO's approval rating. So I'll start by describing the policy Fermi framework. This encapsulates a 40% weighting, the most important division by far. And the reason is because the pandemic response is the most prevalent and egregious thing to consider for the Mexican population at any country for that matter. And policy is the best way to observe objectively how an administration is doing during its tenure.
So next we have personal perception, which encapsulates variables like AMLO's favorability in the media and news, his speeches, fact-checking, the way he presents himself, political opponent propaganda, and more. So we rated personal perception at 27% because of how substantively the media, speeches, and personal image of AMLO influence how the general population of voters in Mexico perceive the government, which directly affects approval rating.
Next, we're going to be looking at economy, which we gave it around 20%. And economy, we're going to be looking at some variables, including economic variables, such as the GDP, unemployment rate and Gini coefficient, as well as government confidence and the public perception of the economy.
Civil liberties was rated the lowest at 13%. And civil liberties includes human rights violations, which include three things, which are torture, crime, and unfair deaths. And then militarization is included in civil liberties because an increase in militarization has been linked to an increase in human rights violations. And under progressive rights, that includes women's rights. I think we've all seen the international attention that the women's rights movement had been getting in Mexico, as well as indigenous rights. And then finally, freedom of speech. We rated this at 13% because we found that, based on opinion polls, that Mexican people are concerned and about civil rights and kind of the amount of human rights violations, but they're more concerned about the economy and the pandemic response and policies like that. So that's why we rated it around 13%.
Indeed. And so just summarizing this, if you recall, imagine that we are observing the perception of AMLO from a Mexican citizen. So let's imagine that Paul is our resident Mexican citizen here who is attempting to cite his approval for AMLO. Well, that means that according to our framework, he'll consider policy as his most biggest and most important factor because he really wants administration to do something about the pandemic. And then he'll weight personal perception at 27% at the second most important because he is attracted by the media and he is influenced by the media. He is also going to want to consider economy at this third because even though it's high-level variables, he wants to be able to ensure that the economy is doing well, and civil liberties, as Grania mentioned, because the human rights violation is obviously important to everyone. And so now we'll be presenting the actual key findings that we found in our research, some of the things that you guys need to stay tuned for because these are some really spicy findings. So first and foremost, we'll be presenting the base rate that we were able to find. We were able to base our projection off of a February 2021 approval rating of 64%, from which we will create our projection off of.
We're also going to be looking at Mexico's economy in terms of a research division, and we feel like this is going to be going up simply because of economic consequences because of the pandemic. And because of this, we're going to be seeing that Mexico's economy is going to see a general recovery. And not just that, there's also going to be an increase in international trade, specifically because of changing administrations between Trump and Biden and how there's planning to be an increase in trade and a decrease in tariffs between the two countries.
For political competition, we believe that this will also be an aspect that is beneficial to AMLO because for the midterm, a new development is that in Mexico, there are many political parties. It's much more fragmented than in the US. And for this midterm, a coalition of centralist and right-wing parties have banded together in order for the goal of gaining majority seat over AMLO in the House. And while the banding together of these parties do pose a greater competition to AMLO, AMLO has always talked about his enemies as kind of grouped together corrupt parties. So the fact that they are joining together kind of goes to prove his point in popular media.
So in terms of propaganda and persona, we expect this to have a positive effect and help AMLO in the midterm elections. So in the 2018 presidential elections, AMLO's persona and platform were built on relatability, anti-elitism, anti-corruption, etc. And this really resonated with voters in Mexico and helped AMLO gain a really strong base of supporters, which will continue helping him into the midterm elections. And government propaganda and influence over the media in Mexico have also helped AMLO maintain his high approval rating because interestingly, every morning he engages in press conferences with journalists in Mexico. And these have been said to be very influential because millions of voters in Mexico will tune in. But critics have said that these press conferences are like a worrying instrument of misinformation because there's a lack of fact checking and just because of how many voters tune into the conferences every day.
Next, in relation to militarization, we have our first downside. And what that means specifically is that we believe that the utilization and the continuation of militarization forces will negatively affect the approval rating for AMLO within the next few months. And the reason we think that is because of two primary things. One is because of the cozying relationship between AMLO and the military. Now, this is in regards to the implementation of policies that basically look the other way for the past atrocities that the militarization have conducted. There have been independent investigations that have tried to subpoena different court orders or different records within barracks, but AMLO has decided to look the other way by implementing policies regarding opaqueness in these records. Similarly, he has also attempted to use the military as a policing force during the pandemic time. And the reason being is because his National Guard seems to be his way of making sure that the policing efforts are able to combat organized military intervention or organized drug cartels more effectively.
For civil liberties, we also thought this would be a negative point against AMLO because of the amount of human rights violations and as a result of the increase in militarization through the National Guard, as Evan mentioned, as well as his kind of use of politics of resentment, as Chloe mentioned before, where he kind of paints people who, or news sources that are against him as conservatives who want to return to the far right. And that is a fear for many people. So the amount of human rights violations, again, is only increased, and the amount of femicide isn't increased as a part of that. And he's been continuously dismissive of the women's rights movements, calling them conservatives who are just out to get them, as well as news sources that criticize him at all, calling them conservatives again. And he has been famously dismissive of civil groups.
Mm-hmm. And finally, in regards to the pandemic response, if you've read the news and you've read anything about the Mexican response, you would know that Mexico does have an egregious caseload and death load relative to the rest of the world, just like their sister populist country, Brazil, and Jair Bolsonaro administration. And the reason being is because AMLO, like his populist partner, Jair Bolsonaro, is relatively dismissal of the COVID-19 pandemic. And foregoing COVID-19 lockdowns and the like in favor of liberty and freedom of movement. Now, that being said, he has done a relatively good job in making sure that vaccinations are implemented in a timely manner. So far, there have been 5.7% of the population that have been fully vaccinated, and around 10 to 15% of the population has been administered at least a single dose. So in that regard, we actually believe his pandemic response in the next few months will help his approval rating, particularly because of his vaccination efforts. Now, in regards to the other tenets of policy, we need to consider that his crime, his corruption, and his welfare policies all play a role in helping shape public perception. But that being said, indicated that they have been relatively lackluster. They have not been negative outlays in that they have been astonishingly bad, but at the same time, they have been ineffectual in their promises. Now, what does this actually mean for our projection? Specifically, what does it mean for our honorary Mexican resident Paul? Well, the numbers are up here. So starting with policy, we believe that the policy will help the approval rating increase, but very marginally by 0.23%. And the reason so is because of this contradictory element. The fact that there will be high vaccination rates means that that is a good thing for pandemic response and policy, but ineffectual policies in crime, corruption, and welfare, as well as inability to mitigate caseloads, will mean that that serves as a deterrent.
So next, personal perception. Based on our research and analysis, we expect this division to increase approval rating by 0.88%. And the impacts of AMLO's daily press conferences and its favorable persona on voters were found to be the most significantly influential factors that will likely continue to help him into the midterm elections.
We expect the economy to affect the approval rating by 0.38%, simply because we see economic variables going up. So, for example, GDP per capita and the unemployment rate are going to be like benefiting in the next coming months because you're going to be seeing an economic recovery after the pandemic. Moreover, you're seeing that confidence in the economy is going to be increasing because people are seeing an economic recovery. They're seeing an increase in trade, and there's also a decrease in polarization, which also has a very high correlation to public confidence in what the economy is actually doing. Last, we actually see that government confidence in the economy is also going to be increasing. And this is because the government has a generally high perception of what's going to be happening to the economy in the future because they've made a lot of campaign promises. They're doing a lot of work simply in terms of passing laws and bills in terms of what can be happening in the future. This combined with general economic recovery is going to be leading to better confidence and better perception.
Now for civil liberties, it's like the one decrease, so it gets to be the outlier. Because as said before, there's only been an increase of human rights violations without accountability for the military through things like the National Guard. And I really hate to call Paul, our honorary citizen, sexist, but so like women's rights seems to be on the back burner, Paul, but because he's more concerned about how the economy is doing, again, with unemployment and GDP, as well as policy around vaccinations getting rolled out and personal perception of AMLO through the media and things like that. So unfortunately, Paul cares the least about women, which is kind of sad, and torture, which is also kind of sad, Paul. But again, he is our honorary Mexican citizen and he's experiencing life. So there's civil liberties protection.
Now, what does this actually mean aggregated and collectively? Well, if you calculate and tabulate the math, it means that we believe that AMLO's approval rating will go up by 1.3% from 64%, which was the February 2021 figure, to 65.3% by the midterm elections. Now, one thing that comes especially to note is the relative conservatism of this projection. Why is this projection so conservative? Why don't we project a 5%, a 10%, a 20% increase in this approval rating? Well, for starters, you have to try to dig deeper into some of the things that we did mention. There was hesitancy in some of the topics. As you recall, for example, for the policy section, even though the vaccination efforts seem to be a good driver for his approval rating, there are other factors within the policy factors, such as his anti-crime and anti-corruption policies that actually serve as deterrents. So all these different deterrents actually make it so that his approval rating will not change by too much, at least as what we predict. Now we'll present a policy that we believe could be enacted in relation to the research we've conducted.
So our policy suggestion for increasing AMLO's approval rating and for the benefit of Mexico society is to increase investment in education. Right now, the per student annual spending at the primary and secondary education level in Mexico is less than a third of the average per student annual spending for countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. While Mexico's spending per student is relatively high compared to their GDP, we believe that this is an aspect that they can really improve on and see benefits from. Some aspects in which some benefits we'll see from an investment in education includes long-term economic benefits, as increased education is linked to increased GDP in the long term. In the short term, with AMLO being a populist president, this is an action that benefits the general people, especially the poor individuals, poor and middle class individuals. And this is an action that is going to be good for his personal image. On the policy front, this is also something that will be supported likely by his supportive base and also the general lower middle class people.
So that's all we have today in today's presentation. I hope you've enjoyed our 3 presentations. If you have any questions, please ask them away. Hello, Mauricio.
Hi, Evan. Yeah, so I have a question about the policy specifically. I guess I'm a little confused as to the connection between the policy and the predicted adjustment on the approval rating. You're not saying that the policy could possibly result because of the shifts in approval rating, or is that what you're saying?
I can take that. I don't think that's what we're saying. I think it's more so of we're looking at aspects that influence AMLO's approval rating, and we're seeing that if we were AMLO, what policy would we enact to better our approval rating?
Okay, that makes sense. Can I have a follow-up? That's okay. What are like I guess some consequences, like tangible consequences of like this predicted shift in its approval rating, besides maybe some policies that he could try to pursue to improve it himself, like you mentioned? Like what are some tangible like consequences?
That's a good question, Mauricio. So in terms of tangible consequences in regards to a shift in the approval rating, well, there are several, and my team members can also contribute to this discussion if they wish so, but there are several that we have to be considerate of. One is the fact that there is a partisan politics being played as in terms of like how you produce yourself and how you represent yourself. If you see yourself having a negative downturn in terms of your approval rating, that kind of forebodes some negative reaction from the people. And so what that essentially means is that you will need to do some Hail Marys. You may need to do risky investments in risky politics in order for you to be able to increase your policies or increase your approval rating, because going down further is not a deterrent for you. Whereas if you see your approval rating gradually going up, then your mindset would be more attached towards doing the status quo. And so what that means for AMLO would be basically doing very much of the same things that we've encapsulated in our research.
That makes no sense, yeah.
Another thing that you could consider for like tangible benefits of approval rating is the actions of AMLO like could reflect on Morena. So that could have repercussions for elections, although this is just midterms, but that could be a tangible effect in the future.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Keshav?
Yeah, I was wondering, to what extent does the immigration situation play into AMLO's approval rating? I remember that the Trump administration had pressured AMLO to deploy the National Guards along Mexico's southern border to prevent Central American refugees to enter the U.S. And he'd received pushback in his left-wing coalition for that. And even now, the refugee applicants are residing in Mexico as they're being processed in the U.S. So is that impacting his approval rating, or has that sort of been baked in and people are used to those policies?
That's a very excellent question. So I'll go with the preliminary answer here. And again, my team members can contribute. So we did consider immigration to be a pertinent research division and or Fermi framework in the very beginning. But the idea is that there are underlying factors that push people outside of Mexico, right? And these are the divisions that we did encapsulate. So as you remember, Mexico's economy is going to be one such one, and civil liberties is going to be such another one. And so we decided to focus more on the underlying factors pushing people from immigration as opposed to immigration as a topic itself. Now, in related to the National Guard, that encapsulates the militarization technique, right? So understanding that the utilization of the military as an abuse of power could be seen as negative to AMLO's approval rating, but perceiving it as something that is just a policing effort may make it not a negative approval or negative perception to the approval rating.
Got it. Thank you.
I know that we are currently over time, so George, do you want to wrap things up?
Yes, thanks, Evan, and thanks Latin America team for the great showcase. Also, thank you for everyone who came to listen in on our presentations, including Keshav, Matt, Nishant, and a few others who tuned in for the earlier ones. Really appreciate y'all's participation. And then to all of GMT, great job, guys. We did it. How about internal members, let's stay. And then everyone else, you're free to go. Have a good day.
Thank you for coming.
Bye. All right. Thanks, guys.
Graduating, yay!
What did you say, graduating?
Yes.
Oh, we're graduating. Oh yeah, we are graduating.
George, whenever you were like, we did it, guys, I got major Kamala Harris vibes. You know, when she called Joe, she was like, Joe, we did it.
Oh,
You're gonna be president. Major vibes.
Wow, wow. That's an honor to be compared to the vice president.
We can stop recording.
Oh yeah, we can. Thanks, Evan.